Alright, what's up guys? My name is Zach and today I am driving a 1980 Pontiac Phoenix LJ. Up front is a 2.5 liter inline 4 and down below is a 3-speed automatic transmission. Now I am super excited to be driving this Phoenix because this is kind of a forgotten car. I've never driven one of these before, but also this came at a really weird era in the United States and was really looked down upon when this car first came out, so they only really made it for 4 model years. And so I am excited to be driving Daniel's Pontiac Phoenix today because it probably is one of the nicest examples still left in existence. But if you would like to submit your own vehicle and have it reviewed by me here on the channel, you can head on over to my website, zackpradel.com/submit. It's a quick and easy submission form. It takes under a minute to fill out, and I come out to you. But let's get back to that 2.5 liter under the hood. I'm sure you've heard of it before. It is the Iron Duke 2.5 from General Motors. If you're wondering where you heard that before, it was also used in the later Pontiac Fiero and in our mail trucks. Now the one pictured here actually has the 2.2 liter, but 99% of them had the 2.5 Iron Duke in them. So odds are your mail was delivered this morning here in the United States from an Iron Duke, this exact engine. It is carbureted, and so to start it, had to pump the gas a couple times. It's still of that sort of transitional era, a little bit before fuel injection was super common. But what it is reliable. It's a very, very reliable engine. The owner, Daniel, says he's owned over 18 different vehicles, and this is by far the most reliable and fuel efficient. He averages around 35 miles to the gallon when everything is working correctly, which is most often. Now, like I said, paired to it is a 3-speed. That's a little bit less enjoyable. I wish I had a little bit higher of a gear for higher speeds, but around town, you're not gonna really notice. It's still shifting here over 40 years later, and I can't really knock it too hard. Last but not least, this is front-wheel drive, which I think was part of the issue, was that the majority of American market was starting to switch over to front-wheel drive, and Americans didn't really like that. So this is a front-wheel drive, and we'll talk about that more later on. How does it feel to drive a Pontiac Phoenix? Well, it's an interesting mix. It's a more harsh version of the J body that came throughout the 1980s. Now, this isn't a body for body example of that. This is actually the X body, which was later replaced by the N body. Try to keep up with all these letters. But I have a lot of experience driving Cavaliers, Cimarrons, Skyhawks, and it drives like that, which I actually think is quite enjoyable. It has a little bit more vague steering than what I'm used to, but the throttle is decent. Visibility is good. The suspension is relatively comfy, all things considered, and so I'm actually quite pleasantly enjoying my time in the Phoenix. With that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the interior. Well, in front of me, I only have 2 gauges. Off to the left is my speedometer. Off to the right is my fuel. That's all I need to know. On the steering wheel, I don't get anything besides a little Pontiac badge, and that's it. This is way before the airbag era. However, the horn still works. Kind of delightful to see. Off to the left, I have 2 little climate control vents. Feel like this could have been 1, but they did too. And my light switches. And moving onto the door, I have my manual mirror adjustments. Latch to get in and out. Moving into the center, I actually have more gauges here, which is kind of interesting. So I do have my coolant temperature, my oil pressure, battery voltage, and the quartz clock. And then, to make it symmetrical, they gave you 4 circular climate control vents. Again, I guess in the 1970s, they just had an excess of climate vents that they could just toss them wherever they wanted, because it's most certainly how it feels here in the Phoenix. Then we do have our air conditioning and heating options. So this was outfitted with factory AC, which is lovely and not common at all. Then we do have our radio, which is AM and FM, and our stereo cassette player. Love to see those little 1970s/1980s touches. However, through all this, we don't have any cup holders. So, unfortunately, by default, the 1980 Pontiac Phoenix fails the big friggin' bottle test. Then we gotta talk about the seats. Now, the seats are finished in this really interesting pattern. You'll also find it on the door card, and the name is currently escaping me, but you'll see it up on screen right here. And the interesting thing is that it's this sort of puffed up brown fabric that's laid on top of black fabric, which looks really cool. However, when it starts to age, that puffed up fabric starts to go away and it just leaves the black underneath, making these seats look ridiculously dirty. I promise you, these seats are clean, but it's just the way way that the fabric has aged, it makes them look permanently dirty. Kind of a big downside for this fabric type of this era. However, speaking of seats, we do have back seats, so let's go do a back seat review. All right, so we're in the back of the 1980 Pontiac Phoenix LJ. LJ was like the luxury version. However, no one can agree on what it means. What a lot of people end up saying is that it just literally means luxury jargon, which jargon is just kind of like a nonsense fluff word. So yeah, that's what it is. But back here, the seats are super plush and comfortable. You see a little bit more of that pattern, a little bit better back here, which I really enjoy. You get to enjoy the very, very 70s headliner. I mean, I can't really figure out why people loved brown so much in the late 70s and early 80s. But this is example A, B, and C of brown on brown. Anyway, no center console. I do get an ashtray. That's my only amenity back here, which is hilarious to see. And I don't have any shoulder belts. I only have lap belts back here. And these rear seats actually do fold, sort of taking a card from the import scene, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. A lot of the Toyotas, Hondas, Nissans, that sort of thing, they had that feature, so this has it as well, which is very, very cool. But let's hop out. We'll take a quick look at the trunk and cargo space, and then we'll talk about the looks. All right, around the back of the Pontiac Phoenix from 1980, and two very 70s and 80s things going on. First of all, we do have two different keys. So the square is for the ignition, the circle is for the trunk and doors, but also GM was known for doing this sort of hidden push it to the side emblems to hide the rear locks. They did this on their Cadillac products as well. Open it up like that. And we have apparently the world's largest comb. It's a super comb, apparently. That's kind of interesting. Not factory to the car, obviously, but here we have tons and tons of space. Again, this was to compete with a bunch of the import hatchbacks, and I think in size, they actually did very, very well. We do have a little light over here. Very, very cool. Car's off. Otherwise, that would be on. We do have some cool, like, period General Electric stuff, which is really, really cool to see. I'm sure people have plenty of memories with that sort of thing, but no real crazy amenities. You could put a privacy cover here if you wanted to. This one does not have that. I imagine that's incredibly hard to find here for an X-body chassis, but overall, very, very cool to see the back of the Pontiac Phoenix. Now we gotta talk about the looks, and this is brown lightning if I've ever seen it. If the interior wasn't enough for you, this is brown on brown on brown on brown. The rear taillights have a sort of louver design to them, and it's just a very interesting period of car design because we're coming out of the 70s, which were giant, square, chunky automobiles, and moving into the smaller era of the 1980s. And if you've ever needed a visual representation of vehicle change, this is it, because it's caught between both worlds. It still has that brutal 1970s edge to it, but it's pocket size like the 1980s. So I just love that factor about it. However, with all of that being said, let's get on to my final thoughts. What do I think driving a Pontiac Phoenix from 1980? Well, I do want to talk about this car's history and importance. So, this came at the end of the 1970s. As we know, the 1970s was the fuel crisis and probably one of the biggest changes in the automotive industry ever. Emission standards were now a thing, which restricted big engines. We had to downsize our vehicles for the first time in history. And so what ended up happening was Japanese automakers like Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and Mazda started coming over here and selling their vehicles with their little engines that they've been making for several decades and had nearly perfected. So the American automakers were losing out hand over fist to these new Japanese imports. So what did the Americans try to do? Well, they tried to make their own Japanese imports. 4-cylinder, front-wheel drive, little cars. That was the formula that they saw working in the imports. So here's what they made: a 4-cylinder, front-wheel drive, little car. And people were pissed because Americans didn't want to give up their big cars. Although it was a harsh reality that they all ended up having to deal with, they didn't want to. And so this car got a lot of criticism, it got a lot of hate, and it got a lot of nasty reviews because comparing it to the land yachts that came before it, Yeah, this is less luxurious. Yeah, this is less powerful. Yeah, the wrong wheels are driving it. But it's not the Phoenix's fault. It's actually a decently nice car. It is a little bit rougher around the edges than the imports of the era. This isn't quite Toyota quality or Honda quality or Nissan quality for that matter. But it was an attempt to adapt to the changing market. Us Americans just weren't ready to accept that. But at the end of the day, this is reliable, it's economical, it's ready to drive you wherever you need to go. And so more than anything, it's just misunderstood. And the other part of the story that I really, really like is that now, 40 years later, I'm fortunate enough to have the whole story as opposed to the developing story back in the 80s. What ended up happening because of cars like this is the American automakers said, we can't make the cars as good as the imports. So what did they do in the middle of the 80s after they discontinued this car? They started rebadging Japanese imports. So the Toyota Corolla became the Chevy. We started to get Suzuki's rebadged as Geo products. That was how they ended up trying to beat them, was just rebadging their own creations. But that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have gotten those products if it weren't for them trying it first. You gotta try everything once. And we soon realized that it wasn't really our thing. But this car was a trial and an error that had to happen. And so it's so cool to be driving that cornerstone, that significant piece of automotive history. It helped shape our landscape of automobiles even today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Huge thank you to Daniel Bones for letting me take out his Pontiac Phoenix. If you know Daniel, you know about this car. He's driven this from here in Oregon down to Salt Lake, California, all around. This was his daily driver for quite some time. And I can see why. It's actually quite a little peach. Huge thank you to Daniel. I filmed a bunch of his vehicles here today. He's been a wonderful asset to the channel, and I can't thank him enough. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to rate the video, comment on the video, and subscribe if you really liked it. Take care, guys.